All right, how about them Buckeyes the other night? They put a world of hurt on the Wolverines. It looks like we're headed for another national championship. I am the Internet Skeptic, and the topic today is going to be global warming. We're going to be putting this presentation together. What I encourage you to do is go to the website www.theinternetskeptic.com. Download this presentation. This presentation is out there for you to download and do whatever you want. Each one of these pictures or graphics or text will be linked to the original documentation or research. I am not a global warming scientist, but what we're going to do is we're going to review the science behind it. We're going to take a critical eye and take a look and see, does the conclusion reached by the global warming scientists support the data, or does the data support their conclusion? We're just simply going to review it, give a very common sense look at the data, and we're going to let you decide. The whole objective here is for me to say something and for you to say, that's not true, or that can't be true. Because after all, I am the Internet Skeptic. As soon as you think that can't be true, go download the presentation, click on the slide, it'll take you to the original research and show you. I think that by the time we get to this, you'll understand that there's a lot of holes in this theory. But most importantly, I want you to think in terms of good scientific practices. I'm going to be putting this in context of, if a drug company did this type of research, would you trust that drug? It's a review of the science, not necessarily whether global warming exists or doesn't exist. We're going to simply look at it from a critical eye, from the scientific process or scientific method approach. Do the practices or policies and procedures and techniques that the global warming people use, does it support their conclusion? Is it good science? I encourage you to watch this video. I encourage you to comment on it. We will have it out on YouTube. But once again, before you comment on it, make sure you've downloaded the presentation, gone to the original research. So many times people make comments, they basically attack me without looking at the data. Because the other people, when you put a comment out there, it's out for the world to see. Everybody else is going to download the presentation and decide whether or not you're credible or not. So make sure your comments are credible. Make sure you've looked at the research. Make sure you've done your homework before you criticize what I've done here. The whole key here is I'm not using any original research. I am simply looking at the research that they've published. I'm going to help you understand it. This is basically done in the format of, this is a science lecture or a science presentation. I encourage you to show this to your science teacher and forward this video on to everybody that you can. But once again, you can download the presentation, www.internetskeptic.com. Please share this with as many people as you want. Make comments on it. And most importantly, show this to your science teacher. I'm doing this in the manner that would be good for a science lecture, to show you how to use the scientific method, the scientific process to evaluate scientific research. Right. Here we go. Once again, Internet Skeptics Guide to Global Warming. A look behind the numbers. All right. Once again, here we go. Global warming, a look behind the numbers. The Internet Skeptics Guide to Global Warming. Once again, I am not a global warming scientist, but I am going to use my scientific background to review the data. I'm going to do it in a down-to-earth level so that you can understand what's going on. So often they speak in terms that most people won't understand. I've tried to put this in a manner that anybody's going to understand what's going on. Okay? I gave this to the Libertarian Organization recently. This slide is basically unnecessary. Whenever you see this dog, however, the dog is chasing his tail, meaning that it's a waste of money. We're chasing our tails. We're not really getting anything accomplished. The reason I gave this to a Libertarian organization, if you happen to be a Libertarian, is because environmental policies often rob people of their freedoms, liberty, and even life, and we're going to see that. Libertarians typically want smaller, more effective, and honest government. If we're going to make policy based upon global warming, we're going to want to make sure this is honest science. Okay? And once again, John Stossel is a famous libertarian, and he spends a lot of time on global warming, and you're going to see, why would a libertarian be spending so much time on global warming? Well, it's because of those concerns. Here is global warming. This is the presentation given by the Union of Concerned Scientists. Once again, if you download this presentation, simply click on that and it'll take you to the research where I got it. The whole key behind global warming or greenhouse effect is that CO2 builds up in the atmosphere. CO2 traps heat. Trapping the heat creates an increase in temperature. Basically, greenhouse gases are viewed as insulation for the globe. They trap heat. CO2 is the one that you'll hear environmentalists speak about the most. Here is basically some data. I got this data from John Hart, the University of Berkeley. He gave a presentation here at Ohio State University. And as you can see, the whole argument that the environmentalists make is CO2 increases. The CO2 is coincident with an increase in burning of fossil fuels. So man burning fossil fuels led to an increase in greenhouse gas CO2. Okay? This is what some of the top scientists are saying. Al Gore says this in his movie. Once again, if you disagree with this, you might as well turn the video off right now because I'm relying upon this being the theory. Once again, man burns petroleum products or deforestation, CO2 is increased. Down here, his conclusion is the increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide is primarily due to world energy consumption and secondarily due to deforestation. Two causes, both by man. Man's energy consumption, man deforestation. Man's evil and man's causing it. Here is another chart. This is similar to the chart Al Gore uses in his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. This was once again given by the scientist John Hart. Clearly, he shows CO2 going through the roof. Up in 2001, you can see CO2 is at a level never seen before. In fact, the current level of today is way above anywhere on the chart, which is 150,000 years. CO2 has been driven to record highs. This is what's called the hockey stick chart. This is a temperature measurement going back 1,000 years. And as you can see recently, you can see temperature shooting through the roof. The correlation is given that CO2 increases, temperature increases. They showed CO2 going through the roof, now they show temperature going through the roof. How can anyone possibly disagree that man is causing global warming? First half of 2006, warmest on record in the U.S. Temperatures are at record highs. Okay? There's undeniable global warming. There's a scientific consensus. Nobody out there disagrees that global warming is going on. If you download this presentation, you can click down here at the bottom and you go to YouTube and you'll see Sir David Attenborough tell you everybody agrees global warming is going on. And you got to be asking yourself right now, if everybody agrees, why am I disagreeing? Well, you're going to see. And I think by the end of this, you're going to realize that if everybody does agree on this science, we're in some serious trouble. So what are the facts? The facts are CO2 is a global warming gas. Man produces CO2. CO2 causes global warming. Man-made or anthropogenic CO2 is the main cause of global warming. That is the environmentalist theory behind global warming. I am going to address these issues. So if you believe global warming to be anything else, I'm not going to be addressing that. But this is the argument Al Gore makes in his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. This is the agenda that the environmentalists are pushing. This is why they come up with some such things as carbon taxes and all these other sorts of ways for the government to take increased tax revenues based upon petroleum production. Okay? The whole key is man-made CO2 drives global warming. Okay, let's go back and let's take a brief history. Some of you may be too young for this, but when I was a child, the fear wasn't global warming. It was actually global cooling. And here's the presentation. This was from 1975. And it comes from on Newsweek, The Cooling World. This is just last week in Newsweek. Remember global cooling? They're going back and revisiting. When I was a child, the fear wasn't global warming. The fear was global cooling. And this was just 30 years ago. So within the last half a century, we've gone from global cooling at coming ice age to global warming. These people have been 180% wrong just within the last 30 years. And now they're telling you, buy into this global warming, elect Al Gore because he's going to save the world. Once again, they've been dead wrong just within the last 30 years. The other thing they're dead wrong about, okay, when I was growing up, you had a population bomb. You know, every single square foot of the arable land was supposedly going to be covered by a human being by this time. We had a 10-year supply of oil. Jimmy Carter, President of the United States, in the 1970s, Jimmy Carter somberly told the nation that we could use up all the proven oil reserves in the entire world by the end of the next decade. The result? The price of oil plummeted during the 80s. Okay, we had an oil glut, and just recently have oil prices started to go back higher. So they have been consistently wrong on many, many issues. Okay? More ironically, if you take a look at this research that they did back in the 70s, when they were talking about it coming ice age, today you're hearing about the fear of everybody about this melting polar ice cap. Okay? Well, back then they recommended actually melting it, and that's no joke. Once again, don't take my word for it. Download the presentation, click on this, and it'll take you to the presentation. Back then, the proposals, such as melting the Arctic ice cap by covering it with black soot, okay, they were actually proposing melting the ice cap. Also, they talk about the fear that if this, the catastrophic effect if the ice cap melted. Well, actually, back in the, I believe, 1400s, the ice cap had melted, or maybe before then. The Chinese actually have a report of where they sailed around the Arctic without any ice. So within the last 1,000 years, supposedly the ice cap had actually melted. Okay. Here's another thing that comes from the National Geographic. I just point out some of the key points. Once again, you can download this if you want. Experts agree they cannot yet predict climate change with any assurance. Back then, global warming was downplayed as actually beneficial. If you read over here, it says higher temperatures might expand arable land. They were making the argument global warming is actually favorable. Ironically, down here, they say that lower temperatures could produce climate generally wetter, less stable, marked by storms and floods. That's exactly what they're saying today with global warming. So back then, when it served their purposes, they said all these biblical catastrophes were going to be due to global cooling. Now, today, they're saying all these catastrophes are due to global warming. They can't have it both ways. Either global warming causes these catastrophes or global cooling does, but you can't have it both ways. Bottom line is, weather changes dramatically no matter what's going on. They'll use these arguments of weather changes just don't hold water. The other thing is, just within our lifetime, I'm sure many of you have heard about the ozone hole, right? Well, why don't you hear about the ozone hole anymore? Well, the main reason for it is because it's been growing. Now, why is that a problem? Well, because they banned CFCs back in the late 70s, early 80s. Okay? CFC concentrations have been decreasing in the atmosphere, and I stress decreasing since 1995, and yet ozone hole is hitting a record high. Now, how, if a decreasing concentration of CFCs is going on, can a decreasing in concentration cause a record level hole? Okay? Once again, this whole hype about the CFCs proves, once again, is proving to be wrong. More importantly, is we put a lot of people out of business when we banned the CFCs and the refrigerants they produce. Down here, you can see that record heat wave in Europe takes 35,000 lives. I would argue that many of those lives were lost because they don't have air conditioning. One of the main reasons they probably don't have air conditioning is because it's too expensive, because the cost of refrigerants have gone up because we've banned CFCs. So literally, the environmentalists jumping the gun on this ozone hole issue, banning CFCs, increasing the cost of CFCs, has possibly led to the loss of many lives. Okay? But once again, CFCs have been decreasing since 1995, and yet the ozone hole is increasing. If you're going to use normal science, you would argue that banning CFCs has caused the record hole in the ozone. So we should start cranking up CFCs, because clearly a decreasing concentration has resulted in a larger hole. Okay? Once again, we're chasing our tail down here. We wasted a lot of money, put a lot of people out of business. For what? So that people can die in Europe for heat stroke. Okay? The ozone hole is still making record highs. And also, the first time they measured the ozone hole was in the 50s. This was measured through satellites. They don't have any long-term data on ozone holes. And more than likely, what's causing the ozone hole isn't CFCs, it's the sun. You'll see that the sun is making record highs, and so is the ozone hole. Coincidence or correlation, you decide. I'd be willing to argue it's a correlation, not a coincidence. Okay? The other thing where the environmentalists have been dead wrong on is in DDT. I grew up fearing that DDT was one of the worst things out there. Well, just recently, the WHO, which is the World Health Organization, backs the use of DDT against malaria. Not only do they back the use of DDT, they back the use of it indoors, meaning that you don't mind it being concentrated around you, constantly exposed to you. Okay? They argue that we should be using DDT, and yet the environmentalists ban it. More importantly is, we have lost 1 million lives a year due to malaria because of this. Basically, junk science. We've cost 1 million people their lives each year. Okay? Al Gore makes an argument in his movie, and this is a picture of his book. Okay? that because of global warming, the malaria has made it higher up in Kilimanjaro. Okay? If he's fearing malaria, he should be supporting the banning, the use of DDT. Okay? The banning of DDT has created this problem that Al Gore is blaming now on global warming. Okay? More importantly, if you take a look down here, click on this, you'll see that a lot of the banning of DDT was based on junk science. One, the person who invented DDT was given a Nobel Prize. Two, DDT is credited for saving millions of lives and building many of the uninhabitable regions in the world are now habitable because we were able to stamp out DDT. Most ironic, though, is the argument against DDT was supposedly that it harmed birds. Well, this comes right from the report. Birds which hatched, Carson also mentioned that DeWitt's report that controlled pheasants hatched only 57% of their eggs, while those that were fed high levels of DDT, and all their food for an entire year hatched more than 80% of their eggs. So in their studies, birds exposed to DDT actually had a higher hatch rate. Okay? The argument was that it thinned the eggs. Well, for some reason, it looks like thinning of the eggs, which was only marginal and wasn't able to be reproduced in future studies, the thinning of the eggs actually increased the likelihood that this bird would survive. But yet we still banned DDT, and it ended up costing millions of lives. Okay? And when you dig into it, you start to see that there's this agenda behind the environmentalists that they, just like when they wrote the population bomb, the agenda really isn't having to do with this. There's a hidden agenda, and it's an anti-human agenda. They don't like human beings growing and destroying the environment, or what they would describe as, they call living, destroying the environment. Down here is a quote from an official of the Agency for the International Development stated, "Rather dead than alive and riotously reproducing. Population control advocates blame DDT for increasing third world population." Okay? So there's a hidden agenda behind many of these activities that the environmentalists have, and they are very destructive. Okay? Here's some more junk science. Silicone breast implants. Okay, we are scared to death that these silicone breast implants were dangerous. Well, just this week, silicone said there's no fear of silicone. It's a very safe product. I mean, we scared to death millions of women. I mean, look at this poor woman. She's scared to death. Okay? This was a very useful product, and we took it off the market. But worse yet, what did we do when we banned it or when we sued it out of business? We put a lot of people out of business. We crushed Dow Corning. Dow Corning is in bankruptcy. Okay? A lot of people lost their jobs. Many retirement plans had this security, so they lost money. Okay? We destroyed people's lives over junk science. Okay? The other one is, another thing the environmentalists will scare you about is irradiated food. Think about it. Irradiated food, what is that? That's a microwave. Are you telling me that people should be scared about putting food in their microwave? Okay? Once again, it's all hype with no science backing it. Okay? I would make the argument that many of these arguments are just like Luddites. Okay? Rage Against the Machine. These arguments aren't really to support global warming or what their agenda is. It's basically just to slow down the progress of man. There's typically a hidden agenda behind what they're doing. Okay? Now, before we go on any further, and we're going to cover global warming, I want you to think in terms of a scientist. And ignore the fact that this is global warming that we're going to be discussing. Just think in terms of this is a science project, this is a drug research, this is the science that we're going to be doing. Now, when you're dealing with data in any kind of a scientific process, you typically want to use what I would call direct over a proxy. What does that mean? If I can directly measure something, that's a better measurement than if I have to do it by a proxy, by an estimate. What does that mean? That means that if I'm judging the age of somebody, and I have a birth certificate, or I have their teeth, it's probably more accurate for me to go by their birth certificate than estimating their age upon the teeth. Okay? You're going to understand why I'm covering this later on in the presentation. Confirming methodology. Okay? If I'm going to measure someone's temperature, I might take it with mercury, then I might take it electronically, then I might use an alcohol thermometer. But I'll measure it in different ways to get confirming measurements just so I know that my one measurement technique may not be off. Okay? Multiple measurements. I'm not going to just take one measurement. I'm going to take a bunch of them. I'm going to go back. If I'm going to say that you have high blood pressure, I'm going to check your blood pressure multiple times. I'm not going to just take it once and then say, hey, you got hypertension, go take these drugs. Okay? Multiple time periods. I'm going to take it throughout the period. I'm going to take, at 1 o'clock, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. I'm going to take it at various times over different areas to make sure that the blood pressure does remain high throughout the day. Then I'm going to take, let's say I'm doing a study and I want to say what the average city population is. I'm going to take it over multiple locations. I'm going to take an average of many cities within the United States. I'm not going to just simply take the average of one city and say that's the average of America. Okay? Those are the data, do's and don'ts. They may not make sense to you right now, but I just wanted to refresh your memory on good scientific practices, because this is going to come into play later on. It's a very big deal. Okay? Well, let's get back to the future. These are the two cornerstones of global warming theory, or anthropogenic caused global warming, or man-made caused global warming. CO2 increases causes temperature to increase. That's the model we're going to operate on. Man produces CO2, which causes temperature to go higher. Cause and effect. Okay? Well, first of all, let's spend some time and take a look at what exactly are we talking about. We're talking about CO2 as a gas causing global warming. Right? So, as it says, we've got gas. Let's take a look at it. Okay? This comes from the IPCC report, the International Panel of Climate Change report. Comes straight from the report. You can click on this, download the presentation once again from www.theinternetskeptic.com. Download the presentation, click on this, and it'll take you to the actual report, and you be the judge. Most importantly is this is how they describe global warming. The first arrow up here I want you to notice is it's pointing to H2O. Global warming gas, water vapor. Right? No doubt about it. Clouds, water vapor, volcanic activity. There's a whole bunch of things that cause global warming. I do want to highlight one thing. CO2 is up there, as is ozone. Okay? Down here, you'll see that CO2 is referred to as a trace gas, meaning a relatively insignificant gas. There's not a large concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. In fact, it's measured around 330 parts per million. Divide 330 by a million, you essentially get statistical zero. Okay? Down here, once again, this is the IPCC report stating that water vapor, CO2, and ozone are global warming gases and they absorb solar shortwave. Why am I pointing that out? I am making such a big deal about this is because this is their report and they clearly state water vapor in these charts and in these write-ups as being a global warming gas. Okay? So you would think if these are the gases, they're going to be discussed, wouldn't you? Well, here is the reality. Global warming is caused mostly by water vapor. In fact, water vapor explains 95% of the greenhouse effect. Water vapor constitutes Earth's most significant greenhouse gas, accounting for about 95% of the Earth's greenhouse effect. Okay? If you've seen Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore never mentions water vapor. How can you sit there and have an entire movie about global warming and its impact without ever mentioning the most significant greenhouse gas? I don't know, but if I was going to give a presentation and I wanted to have a dishonest presentation, I would do this. I would make sure I didn't talk about the most significant things because they didn't make my case. This is why I'm showing it to you. This is the data. You do your own research. Don't listen to me. Don't listen to Al Gore. You decide. More importantly is water vapor is a greenhouse gas. These environmentalists are telling us that we need an alternative energy source, namely a hydrogen-powered car. Right? What is a hydrogen-powered car's exhaust? Water vapor. Hydrogen-powered cars would simply turn our cities into rainforests. Okay? You're going to replace a greenhouse gas that is far more potent, water vapor, than CO2. So you're going to be cranking out something with far more global warming gas potential than the current existing cars that release CO2. In fact, we'll get to later on, water vapor is 100 times more potential, or has more global warming potential than carbon dioxide does. Okay? And yet they favor a hydrogen-powered car. Okay? Is that really environmentally friendly? Okay? Now, why do I make such a big issue about water vapor? Well, because you'll see that when they discuss global warming, they forget to mention it in the IPCC report. Okay? I'm just going to read this top part up here. Here's an interesting bit of obfuscation. The EPA website on global warming says here, Naturally, and once again you can click on that if you have the presentation, naturally occurring greenhouse gases include water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and ozone. And methane traps over 21 times more heat per molecule than carbon dioxide. And nitrous oxide absorbs 270 times more heat per molecule than carbon dioxide. Nowhere on the site can you find the relative contribution of water vapor. Okay? How can they be blaming CO2 as the global if they don't even know the contribution of water vapor? Unfortunately, they really do. They just don't publish it. Why? Because as soon as they publish it, you'll realize how insignificant carbon dioxide is, and their arguments fall through. Well, by using their own numbers, you can work backwards to figure out what the contribution is. Because if they say it contributes 95%, you know the concentration. You can walk backwards and then put a relative concentration versus CO2 and figure out what the global warming potential is or contribution is of water vapor. Well, they did that. From this, we can learn that water vapor has over 270 times the global warming potential of CO2. So a molecule of water is 270 times more potent in global warming and trapping heat than carbon dioxide. In fact, the global warming potentials, when they're measured in terms of CO2, CO2 has a global warming potential of 1. Water vapor has it as 270. Down here, more ironic, it says, and down here the title is Don't Ask, Don't Tell, because this is the answers they don't want to know. They don't want anyone to ever ask this question, because as soon as you realize that water vapor is 270 times more potent than CO2, all arguments for CO2 go out the window. So you got to hide the fact. You got to hide water vapor. Okay? Weighted estimates for water vapor are not presented because the IPCC, International Planetary Commission, has not established a definitive global warming potential for the water vapor. How in the world can you reach a conclusion that CO2 causes global warming if you don't even know the global warming potential of the most abundant greenhouse gas? Okay, that is the worst science I have ever seen. If you don't understand all the factors or the components that go into your model, how can you possibly reach a conclusion? That's like saying if you're going to have a study on weight loss and you don't know what the caloric intake or the exercise of the individual is. Okay? They don't even have all the pieces together according to their own report, and yet they're telling you CO2 causes it. Okay? Here's just an example. This comes from one of the government reports. When you have water vapor, not available. But they know what methane, CO2, nitrous oxide, they know what the contribution of all these other gases is, but they don't know what water vapor is. They use Na. How could they possibly be able to figure out these, but not water vapor? Does that even make any sense, or are they trying to cover something up? That's why I have good old Richard Nixon over here. Down here it states clearly, global warming potential value for water vapor has not been determined by the IPCC. How in the world can you reach the conclusion that CO2 causes it if you don't know what the most important one is? It doesn't even make any sense. Let's say that when you figure this out, water vapor is responsible for 99.99999% of all global warming. You can't then make the claim that CO2 causes it. But you can't make that conclusion until you know the basics. Okay? Well, here's what it is. Here's the reality. Global warming is caused by water vapor. This is CO2 down here. It's barely even noticeable on the chart. Okay? Why did I put this up here again? Well, because when you read the IPCC report or you listen to Al Gore, you hear that it's CO2. And then you got to ask yourself, how in the world do you take this chart and make this the most significant greenhouse gas? Well, imagine you're doing a study on a cancer research drug, and you have 100 people you give this drug to, and 5 of them die. And you're going to turn this into the FDA. If you wanted to make your drug look effective, what do? You drop the 5 that died from the database. Act as if they never occurred or never even exist. Okay? That way your drug has a 100% efficacy rate. Okay? Well, what are they doing for the global warming science? They just drop water vapor. And voila, when you pull water vapor out of it, out of the remaining greenhouse gases, CO2 becomes most significant. Okay? That's basically playing with numbers. That's fraud. If this was a drug company that did this, the CEO would be arrested, and all the scientists. This is flat out fraud. Okay? When you pull out water vapor and you ignore water vapor, then CO2 becomes the most significant of the remaining trace gases. Okay? But clearly, it doesn't contribute that much to atmospheric warming. When you put all this together, okay, when you include water vapor, and remember, man only produces 5% of atmospheric CO2 anyways. So you're getting 5% of a sliver when you put all this together, man produces 0.28% of all greenhouse gases. Now, are you telling me this 0.28% is enough to warm the earth and cause all these catastrophes? Just common sense. This 0.28, do you think man can do that much damage with 0.28%? Okay? I would argue not a chance. Especially considering one volcano is going to produce far more than that 0.28%. Mother Nature handles that kind of pollution every other day with no trouble at all. Okay? Human additions represent a small percentage of total greenhouse gases, basically 0.28%, that they are barely visible on this pie chart at the scaled representation. Once again, don't take my word for it. Download this presentation, click on it, and it'll take you to the research. Here's something I found out on Google Images. They're having fun with Al Gore's movie. However, it points out the same thing. Water vapor is up to 40,000 parts per million. CO2 is only 370 parts per million. Once again, water vapor is just far more important. They know about it, okay? And this is their explanation. This, by the way, is real climate science from climate scientists. This is the website that climate scientists created, basically to address many of the questions that skeptics like myself have. And they do a good job of answering almost every question I've been able to come up with, because when you start looking at their data, very logical questions come up. Like, for instance, why they don't consider water vapor? Well, sure enough, they'll have an answer for it. Their answers, when you read them, are somewhat like backtracking. It's like someone that's caught with their pants down, and they have to come up with an excuse on, like, what were you doing? I don't find their arguments very convincing, but I'll let that up for you to decide. Here's their argument about water vapor. Why does anyone ever care about greenhouse gases, since water vapor is 98% of the effect, is what they're putting here. This is their conclusion. The overlay, and they make these complicated arguments. Well, there's overlap and this and that and all this kind of stuff. It's not like too complicated of a model to model anyways. We can't even model the S&P 500, which is a market index, let alone the complexity of the weather. The overlap complicates things, but it's clear that water vapor this is their own conclusion, by the way. It is clear that water vapor is the single most important absorber, between 36 and 60% of greenhouse gas, and together with clouds makes up between 66 and 85%. So even the greenhouse greenhouse warming scientists agree water vapor is what's causing it, but Al Gore never mentions it. Also, the other thing is you'll never see them do, if in fact atmospheric CO2 does cause global warming, wouldn't you think they'd have some kind of an experiment out there where they had an enclosed system and they just simply doubled the CO2 with the same amount of light and measured it and measured the temperature increase? Don't you think that you would see them they've done that? Try to find it anywhere. They haven't even done the basics. More than likely they have done the basics, and what they find that by increasing CO2 the temperature doesn't go up. However, later on you'll see that they have done this with solar input, and you'll see that it does lead to a predicted change. Once again, if this was true, anybody out there with a little terrarium, a little bit of CO2, and a light could prove it, but nobody's done it yet. The reason is because when they do these experiments, it doesn't give them the conclusion that they would expect. All right, now let's go back and remember what I said about the data. If you're going to sit there and you're going to do a study, and you're going to, let's say, measure temperature, for one, you'd probably want to measure consistently with the same thermometer, so that you know that there's no error in your measurements. So if I'm not going to wake up one day and measure you with a scale, the next day, or with a mercury, then choose another thermometer the next day, then another. I'd try to be consistent. Okay, I would then do it multiple ways to back up my data. I might do a mercury, then an alcohol, then a some other form of thermometer. Well, here's the two data. This is their data, all right? And how did they create this CO2 chart? If you notice here, I highlighted it, ice core data, Mauna Loa. Right? So they took ice core data up to what they claim to be 1950, and then they take data of CO2 from Mauna Loa after 1950. Once again, I want to highlight it. Once again, does that make sense? If you're going to measure CO2, wouldn't you want to have either the Arctic CO2 or Mauna Loa CO2? But why would you ever combine the two? And by the way, it's not a coincidence that it's the recent atmospheric CO2 that they're concerned about, not the past, right? But you don't know what the Mauna Loa data was going back. All you do is know what the ice core data shows. So right here is the first little issue as far as how do you, the data that they use for this. And once again, this also comes from the IPCC report. Okay. What's the problem with that? Well, first of all, the measurement techniques. The data from Mauna Loa comes as an air grab sample or a flash data. These guys go out on the porch, bottle up some CO2, and they measure it. This, by the way, is a direct measurement of CO2. This is a good way to measure atmospheric CO2. The other one is ice core. Well, they drill down into feet of ice and measure CO2. This is a proxy. This is an estimate. They're going to rely upon air bubbles holding CO2, and they're going to estimate what the data was back. Once again, this is direct measurement. This is proxy. Also, you notice the guy's down about a foot or so, foot and a half before he even gets to the ice. This ice that he's standing on is 100 or so years old. Okay, and remember the data stopped for the ice core back in 1950. We're going to get to that in a minute also. This is 13,700 feet. This is sea level or even maybe even below, depending on where he is. This is tropical, surrounded by a CO2 spewing volcano and ocean. There's no biomass around at all. So how in the world do you ever reach the conclusion that this is a good way to create a chart? You have one part with low CO2 levels, okay, combined with one part with high CO2 levels. Their conclusion is that CO2 has been increasing in the second half of the century. They reached that conclusion using that data. That to me is absurd. Two, this is only two sources. They took data from Arctic and Mauna Loa. That's how they're going to judge atmospheric CO2 over the entire globe. Don't you think they'd be taking CO2 measurements all around the world? If they're going to claim that CO2 is increasing, don't you think they'd have measurements from all around the world instead of two spots, one that you know is cranking out a lot of CO2? That to me is bad science. Okay? The other obvious question is if they're going to use two different methodologies, core samples and flash samples, why didn't they use flash samples from the Arctic? Why do they go to the other end of the world, up 14,000 feet, to get core samples to make their argument? Okay? That to me is a deliberate attempt to manipulate the data. Okay? Because clearly if you're going to go from core samples to flash samples, you want to at least stay in the same region, but they don't. They have two totally dissimilar areas, the Arctic and Mauna Loa. They don't overlap them. They're two distinct periods. And they make the claim that because Mauna Loa is shooting through the roof, global CO2 is going through the roof. You just can't make that kind of an argument based upon that data. What that essentially is doing is, let's say the first half of the century, you're doing a research on a weight loss drug. The first half of the century, the people didn't take the drug, just like the guy drilling an ice core. The second half of the century, instead of using the sumo wrestlers as your data sample, you come over here and you measure the average weight of supermodels. Your conclusion is that the second half of the century, when the drug was available, people lost weight. Clearly that's absurd. If I did that in any other field of science, I'd be laughed off the stage. In the global warming science, that's accepted. Okay? Deliberate data manipulation is widely accepted in this field. Okay? Flash data is not the same as core samples. Mauna Loa is not the same as the Arctic. Any more than a sumo wrestler is the same as a top model. Do you mix and match data like that, you could prove that pigs can fly. Okay? More importantly, remember how I said you have to dig down through the snow before you get to the ice core? And I said that ice core is 100 years old? Well, here's the data. Here's the actual data. This comes from a ice core sample called Sipple. This is one of the spots up in the Arctic. And as you can see, the ice core data ends at about 1891. Mauna Loa picks up in 1950. Right off the bat, you should notice that there's a gap in the data. When we were looking at before, there's no gap in that chart. It's a smooth chart, if you remember right. Okay? So how does this become the chart that we saw? Well, first of all, let's read this chart. What does it tell us? For one, it tells us that the CO2 back in 1891 is above Mauna Loa in 1950. So what that means is CO2 actually fell between 1891 and 1950. Does that make sense at all? No. Okay? If you look at the chart, the Mauna Loa of 1950 is the same level of the ice core data back in 1860. So CO2 was flat for basically a 100-year period. There wasn't any increase in atmospheric CO2 according to their own data. But most importantly and most disturbing is there's a gap here. How do you get rid of a gap to make that continuous chart? Bingo! They shifted the data 83 years. Now, I know what you're saying. You're saying, I don't believe this. This is a bunch of bull. I thought so too. Once again, download the presentation, click on it. It'll take you to this website. It shows you the analysis of the data. Clearly, that is fraudulent. I cannot imagine any kind of science where you just simply shift the data 83 years to make sure that you're charged continuously. Okay? The other thing is, why would you be doing any of this anyways? Why are you using core samples, which is a proxy, if you had Flask data available? Clearly, if you had Flask data available, you wouldn't be playing these games anyways. Flask sample or airgraph sample is a direct measurement of atmospheric CO2. So you have to ask yourself, was Flask data available? Well, sure enough, guess what? It is available. You want to know why they don't use it and they use core samples instead? Because if you use Flask sample, which by the way, and I said, remember, you're going to want to take it from, you don't want to just have it from one spot or the other. You want to have CO2 taken from all around the world. Well, they have Flask samples going back to 1800 from all around the world. You've got it from North America, Europe, Peru. Okay? This is the Flask data. This is a direct measurement, not a proxy of atmospheric CO2. Why don't they use it and why doesn't Al Gore want you to know about it? Because back in the 1800s, CO2 was at 550. Today you're down here at 370. CO2 has actually been decreasing over the last 200 years. Al Gore's not going to tell you that. Why doesn't he tell you? Because it doesn't make his argument. Okay? More importantly, is they went with a proxy over direct measurements, which is clearly an attempt at fraud in my book. Okay? There is no reason that I can think of, if you have a direct measurement, to ever use a proxy. That's like saying, if I wanted to judge someone's age, I'd try to judge it by their teeth instead of their birth certificate. That makes no sense. If you do this in the scientific fields, you're covering something up. Okay? This is from Woods Hole. I want to show you how incestuous this data is. This is, once again, the same data. CO2 and temperature. CO2 is hitting record highs. This is from Woods Hole, one of the preeminent environmental organizations out there. Current level is, basically 30%, 25% higher than ever before in history. Okay, higher than any level before in history. Okay, Arctic ice cores, Mauna Loa. They use the same bad data in all their research. Okay, and I can't believe they haven't figured out what bad science is. When I see this, they're choosing to use bad data because it's the only data they can find to support their argument. More importantly, and I'll get to this in a little bit, normally when you have two charts like this, the odd thing about it is what you typically do is you rescale things because you're trying to show a cause and effect, and you overlap them. You don't put one above the other one. You overlap them so you can see the cause and effect and how well they trend together. They don't do that, and it's kind of uncharacteristic for most of science, and I'll get to that in a minute, in a little bit, but I want you to remember how they present this chart. Here it is again, one above, not overlapping, one above. Okay? Here are the peaks of temperature. There were no SUVs back then. There's no SUVs back then. Here is the CO2, record high, 370. They show it in dramatic fashion by having to put it off the chart. But the key is, temperatures are all higher than today. Okay? CO2 is off the record, off the charts. These peaks occurred when we didn't have SUVs or global warming or the industrial age. So what was causing the CO2 and temperature spikes back then that's not causing it today? And once again, this temperature level is below the previous peaks. So how can you have record level CO2s and not have a record peak in temperature? This is the source from the Sierra Club, by the way. Once again, the obvious question is, if CO2 is 25% higher than at any time before in history, why isn't temperature anywhere near an all-time high? Their cause and effect doesn't make sense. If you're going to claim that CO2 causes temperature to increase, how can you have it 25% beyond any level seen before, and yet temperature is actually falling from the most recent peak? None of it makes any sense. Cause and effect. So if you're giving this in a science class, this is one of the greatest examples that you'll see of what an independent and dependent variable is. The independent variable is CO2. The dependent variable is temperature. If you increase the independent variable, you would expect the dependent variable to increase. That's not what's going on. Okay. Well, let's take a closer look. Remember, we took a look at how they played around with the data on the ice core samples or the CO2 levels. They used ice core and Mauna Loa. Well, this is what's called the hockey stick chart. If you want to have a real good lesson in science, search Google hockey stick chart and take a look at this. What I want you to take a look at is this is what is used by the IPC in the IPCC report 2001. This is the temperature graph. Okay. Once again, this is the temperature graph used by the IPCC. We're going to take a closer look at this. Also, I want you to remember about all the monkey business they did with creating that CO2 chart. Let's take a look at this one. Okay. First of all, I want to get back to the direct measurement versus the proxy. Okay. The thermometer was invented in 1714. So you would think that they would use thermometer data, which is a direct measurement, as far back as they can. Well, believe it or not, they don't. If you look here closely, and I highlight it, the first thing is Northern Hemisphere. All of this data comes from the Northern Hemisphere. The reason you hear about Northern Hemisphere is because they don't address the Southern Hemisphere. So how can you have global warming if they don't state what's going on in the Southern Hemisphere? Okay? Well, the reason they don't talk about the Southern Hemisphere is because it's cooling. So you don't have global warming at best using this funny data. They can make it the claim that you have Northern Hemisphere warming but Southern Hemisphere cooling. So right off the bat, this is only for the Northern Hemisphere. More importantly is, how do they create this chart? They use tree rings, coral, ice cores, and historical records. Now, if I'm going to go out there and measure something, at least post 1714, am I going to go cut down a tree and estimate what the temperature is? Especially because tree rings can be influenced by many factors, not just the temperature. The humidity, the amount of light it's getting, a whole bunch of things can influence tree ring. Corals, if I'm going to measure the temperature of something, I'm going to go look at a coral? No, I'm going to go look at a thermometer. But if you look at how they combine these data, once again, they combine these odd data sources. From 1000 to 1980. Once again, 1000 to 1980. Okay? 200 years past the time that they invented the thermometer, they're using tree rings, coral, and ice core. Does that make any sense at all? Why aren't they just using thermometer data? Okay? The thermometer data that they do use, once again, the thermometer was invented in 1714, goes from 1902 to 1998. Okay? So from 1902 to 1980, you have a mix match of all these temperature measurements. Okay? You have coral rings and thermometer. Only after 1980, which by the way is the time that it shoots up, are you using a direct measurement of the thermometer. So this is only good data that they have. It's 20 years or so. Okay? The reason that they use coral and tree rings is because clearly you sandbag the data. You decrease the average, and only once did you remove that sandbagging, the tree rings and the coral, did the temperature shoot up. Okay? Now we're going to take a look at what would have happened if you just would have used temperature data instead of all this other monkey business. You just got a direct measurement, not proxies, direct measurement of temperatures. Okay? Well, ironically, there's a battle going on out there. Okay? If you take a look, and I want to flip back just one page. Okay? If you notice here, it's flat. I don't see any warming period, and I certainly see no periods warmer than today, based on this chart. Right? This is what's called the hockey stick chart, and this is what they're using in the 2001 IPCC report. Well, guess what? They had a chart in the previous one, the 1995 one. Okay? And this is the temperature record that you'll see most everywhere else. Okay? It shows something called the medieval warming period. Remember, the Vikings farmed on Greenland. Right? There's my little missing guy on a milk carton over here. This temperature doesn't show a medieval warming period. This temperature chart that they're using denies the fact that there was ever a medieval warming period. If that is in fact the truth, the Vikings never farmed Greenland. Okay? So clearly the chart that they're choosing to use over the one that they used in 1995 is to hide the fact that the warming temperature today is cooler than it used to be. We don't even have a record temperature in the last 1,000 years for temperatures. Here, if you look here, back in the 1000 to 1300, temperatures were much higher than they were, and this comes from the IPCC report itself. They replaced this chart with this for the most recent one, clearly to hide that fact. Okay? Once again, as I said earlier, Arctic cooling, global warming, the good old people at the Real Climate, if you take a look at that, you'll see that they even understand and they know that the southern hemisphere is cooling. Here is another chart that just came out recently. It shows that there is global cooling to the southern hemisphere, and you can simply download this presentation again, click on it, it'll take you. Once again, even their own data proves that there's no global warming. There's in fact cooling in the southern hemisphere. Okay. Now, remember I said that they use proxies. They use coral rings and tree rings and coral samples and all sorts of things to create a temperature graph, which, you know, clearly ridiculous, especially when you can have a direct measurement. Well, what happens if you go and get a direct measurement? Well, you go to Albany, New York, and this is a great science fair project for everybody out there. You can go directly to this website, download the data, and run a regression on it, or a best fit line. And what you'll see is that when you download the data and run a regression, you'll see that the slope is negative, meaning the temperatures have actually decreased from the early 1800s. The average, when you use Albany, New York, which once again is the longest direct measurement of temperature, Albany, New York had an average temperature of 49.2 degrees in 1822. Today, 2005, the most recent yearly average is 49.2. So over almost a 200-year period, temperatures have been flat. More importantly, as I said, you run a regression on the data, the slope is negative, meaning over the last 200 years or so, temperatures have been decreasing if you use a direct measurement using thermometers. Okay? Once again, they always claim that the Arctic ice core is melting. It's not. It's actually thickening. Okay? Are you confused yet? Well, we're going to get you a lot more confused. But clearly, as you can see, the monkey business that they're doing with the data isn't good science, and it isn't good science practice. Okay? All right. Well, once again, as I said, what you typically want to do when you do these type of things, you want to have multiple types of measurements. You might want to have a mercury thermometer, an alcohol thermometer, an electronic thermometer for measuring temperatures. Well, if you read the IPCC report, they address something called satellite and balloon temperatures. And you'll see that the IPCC report claims that there's a positive change in temperature. Well, these satellites are run by none other than NASA. Well, it strikes me as this is what the IPCC report says. Let's take a look at what NASA says. Once again, the IPCC report says satellite data shows warming. Okay? Well, what does NASA say? NASA says there is no discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere over the last 18 plus years. No discernible warming trend. So who's right? NASA or IPCC? Well, what is that? What are we talking about? Well, there are three types of measurements. There's satellite, there's balloon, and there's basically direct measurement or ground measurement. Okay? Ground measurements are thermometers placed all around the place. Problem is they are influenced by something called the urban effect. They might be on a tar roof. They might be next to a tarred road. They might be near a city that radiates heat. So the direct measurement using a thermometer on the ground isn't very reliable because it's influenced by what it's being measured on or around. Okay, it's called the urban effect or the urban bias. Okay? Here is the satellite and the balloon, and the satellite and balloon temperatures show no warming. But they're averaging temperatures over large distances. They're taking multiple measurements, really sophisticated measurements of temperature, which aren't influenced by urban warming or urban effect, and they are showing no warming. Okay? But the IPCC report produces this argument about reliability data. The problem is the IPCC report pissed off NASA. You don't want to piss these people off. Why? Because they're rocket scientists, and this is what they had to say. Global climate monitoring, the accuracy of satellite data. Basically, NASA felt insulted. Okay? Recently, much scientific debate has focused on the global temperature of the Earth's lower atmosphere as measured by orbiting satellite. Okay? Now remember, these are rocket scientists. While these data are exceedingly precise, verified by multiple satellite observations and balloon measurements taken in situ, meaning in the layer, they reveal no discernible warming trend in the Earth's lower atmosphere in the last 18 plus years. Now remember, they claim all this warming occurred in the last half of a century. So if we remove the last 18 plus, that only leaves 30 years for all this warming to have occurred. And if you look at those charts, temperatures actually fell post-1940 through the 1980s. Okay? So their own data doesn't make any sense when you put all the pieces together. Here, once again, the medieval warming period, our temperatures are just getting back to normal from what's called the Little Ice Age. Okay? Once again, the Vikings farmed up on Greenland, and once again, they're floating around on boats. This is what they were farming Greenland. This is what Greenland is today. It's a chunk of ice. Okay? There's no farming going on up there. And, by the way, they don't have V8 engines driving these boats. Okay? There are no Hummers back. Vikings didn't drive Hummers. Okay? There's no industrial era back then. Go back even further, and you see temperatures have even been warming. So when they make this claim that we're record temperatures, we're not. The only claim that you can make that we're record temperatures is if you use that funny chart that they create called the hockey stick chart. Okay? But I would really encourage you to do some research, do the hockey stick chart. What you find is that hockey stick chart is created by a statistical model, and when they go back and tested it, they found out that if you just simply plugged in random numbers in the model that they had, you would create a hockey stick chart. So there's not a lot of credibility put behind the chart that they're using. Okay? Once again, you can go back even further. You'll see that if you go back even further, the Arctic was tropical. Once again, there are reports about Chinese floating through the North Pole. So within the last 1,000 or so years, 1,000, 2,000 years, the Arctic has been melted. Here we have another chart, but it's basically just showing there's a lot of periods that were warmer than there are today, and it wasn't caused by the industrial era. Okay? Key being the medieval warming period. Okay? Now they know about this, and what is most disturbing is that these reports came out. Once again, that one chart was in the 1995 report. The 2001 report didn't have it. But what's most disturbing is we have quotes from people in between that time period stating that they needed to get rid of the medieval warming period. Okay, this comes from the geophysicist who created some of those earlier temperature charts, who concluded and published climate studies in top-ranked scientific journals. This is what he claimed. Around 1996, I became aware of how corrupt and ideologically driven current climate research can be. This is in 1996. Remember, in the 1995 report, they had the medieval warming period. Okay? In 1996, he becomes aware that there's something going on. A major researcher working in the area of climate change confided in me that the factual record needed to be altered so that people would become alarmed over global warming. This is cover-up type stuff. This is Orwellian 1984 type stuff. This is someone saying, change the history. Okay, rewrite history. We need to manipulate the data to make our case. Okay, we have, and it says right here, he said, we have to get rid of the medieval warming period. And that's exactly what they did. Okay, I'm going to go back here. Once again, medieval warming period, 1995. No medieval warming period, 2001. That's clearly data manipulation. Clearly, they're doing it for a reason. Clearly, they're doing it to get you alarmed. And more importantly, this is fraud. Basically, only a gullible person would buy this. But most importantly is possibly the next president of the United States is this gullible that he would buy this kind of research. That's what frightens me. Do you want that kind of a man with his finger on the button? Just ask yourself. Okay, I certainly don't. Okay? Let me go back to all right, let me go back a few. Lost my spot here. Okay. Okay. Once again, this came from David Deming, is a geophysicist and adjunct scholar with the Oklahoma Council of Public Affairs. I would seriously recommend downloading this presentation, clicking on that, and go doing his research. Once again, the key is they knew they had to get rid of the medieval warming period, and they did. That's what's so frightening about it. Okay. This is something else that they're aware of what they're trying to do, get rid of the global warming period. There's also another period that we just emerged from, and I showed you. It's called the Little Ice Age. This is how these people are looking at this chart and saying, wait a minute, you guys also, not only did you erase the medieval warming period, you got rid of the Little Ice Age. This is what a couple of PhDs from the Harvard Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics said. The facts are simple. The little optimum is the medieval warming period, and the Little Ice Age were real. They were also widespread over the globe. The 20th century is not the least bit climactically unusual. So why the recent media hysteria that the 20th century is the warmest of the last 1,000 years? Okay? They know a lot more about this stuff than I do, and they're saying there's no need to it. More importantly is, our country was founded in the Little Ice Age. If you want to see turmoil, and you're given the choice between global warming or global cooling, I would always choose global warming. People get fed during global warming periods. People starve during global cooling periods. The Little Ice Age, there were a lot of social revolutions, a lot of disease, famine, all sorts of bad things occurred during the Little Ice Age. I encourage you to look up the Little Ice Age, look at the damage that it did. If you notice here, if you go back and look at the winter of Valley Forge, we went through incredible hardships during the Little Ice Age. This is the Delaware River. It's blocked by ice. The Delaware River doesn't freeze over anymore, but that's how cold it used to be. The French Revolution was caused by the Little Ice Age. The reason that it was caused by it is because people were starving in France. Good old Louis lost his head over it. When Marie Antoinette said, "Let them eat cake," the reason she was saying that is because the people were starving. They didn't have anything to eat. They were rioting because they were starving because the Little Ice Age had destroyed all the crops. So given the two, I would always go with global warming. How are we on time? Okay?
Yeah, you have like a minute or so left.
All right, we'll stop here then. New video. Oh, hey Brenda, will you bring me that drink? Hey Brenda, were you just down here or was that my mom?
That was good.
Tell her she can come down now.
I'll say it's fun. I was just studying the French Revolution. You know that let them eat cake thing?
Yeah.
Never said it.
Oh yeah, I know that. I know that.
It's pretty funny. It's like this big video we were watching.
Yeah.
It was like...
Marie Antoinette was supposed. All right. Ready? All right. Okay, don't fall asleep yet. I know we're getting a little scientific on you, but hopefully you'll find this interesting. Once again, I wanted to create this as a science lecture so that you can understand the scientific process, the scientific method. And I keep using the terms cause and effect. Well, this is a great example of cause and effect. There's two types of things. There's a correlation and a coincidence. A coincidence are just two things that go together, but they aren't related. For instance, the population of storks has been decreasing in Europe. So has the birth rate. But the falling population of storks has not caused the European birth rate to go down. Okay, that's called a coincidence. In the financial industry, we always use the example that over time a tree grows higher. Over time, the stock market goes higher. The tree did not cause the stock market to go higher. Okay, so what we have with global warming is we have not a claim to be a coincidence. They claim there's a correlation, meaning that CO2 is related to or causes the increase in temperature. Okay? What binds the two variables is a theory. So if I say the stock market goes up because the Federal Reserve cuts interest rates, you would want to show that as you cut interest rates, the market goes higher. You would not want to see the market go higher before you cut rates. Okay? Another example is this dye up here, or this filter. It shows that there's a gradient. If the theory was that the longer you expose this plastic to a dye, the lower the transparency is going to be. And you can see you would make that theory, you would then dip this in the dye, and you'd measure the transparency and you'd test your theory. That's how a good scientific project would be produced. Okay? So once again, we got to take a look at cause and effect. The key is cause must lead the effect. If I claim that the burner causes water to boil, I would have to show me first turning on the boiler, the heat, time passes, and then water boils. Cause and effect. The independent variable is the heat. The dependent variable is the boiling water. Never, ever would you see the water boil first and then the burner get turned on. If you do find that, you've got a backwards model. Okay? Once again, fire must first be applied before it boils. Heat causes the water to boil. Timing is critical. Heat first, then boiling second. Heat is the independent variable. Water boiling is the dependent variable. Water boiling is dependent upon the heat. If water boils before heat is applied, something is wrong with your model. Okay? It's what's called a misspecified model. Well, let's take a look. The reason, and I kept saying earlier, how normally when you do these kind of charts, you overlap them. You don't put one on top of the other. Well, the reason they didn't overlap them is because you'll see that there's not a relationship like they claim. The top of this chart here shows CO2 is very high and remains very high. Record highs, in fact, for that time period. CO2 remains very high, and yet temperature falls through the floor. How, if CO2 causes temperature to increase, can high levels of CO2 occur during a period where temperatures fall through the floor? That's why they don't overlap the two charts, because then it becomes obvious that CO2 is not causing temperature to increase, because their own charts show that it doesn't. Once again, the way they present the data is fraudulently. More disturbing is they know about this. Okay? Real Climate. Once again, I said these people are doing great at covering their tracks. They've looked at this. They understand that this exists. Their own research shows that CO2 does not increase until 800 or 600 to 1,000 years later. I've seen the estimates of 1,400. Okay? When you run a correlation, that means the temperature is correlated with CO2 800 years away. So what this means is that they're claiming that temperature increases first, and then 600 to 1,000 years later, CO2 increases. So how in the world can CO2 increasing 600 to 1,000 years in the future cause temperatures to increase today? It makes no sense. It's like water boiling today and then turning the burner on 600 to 1,000 years in the future. It's kind of like me being drunk today and drinking a fifth of vodka 600 to 1,000 years in the future. Their model is backwards. CO2 does not drive temperature. Temperature drives CO2. And that makes sense because you have to first warm the earth before things grow. Once things start to grow, they release CO2. Okay? Their own charts show that temperature does not lead, or CO2 does not lead temperature. Temperature leads CO2. And that's their own data. Once again, don't take my word for it. Download the presentation. Do your own research. Al Gore, he uses this argument, if you've seen his movie. This is a scene where he gets on that crane lift. He goes way up here to show you that CO2 is at record highs. Hello, Al. Take a look at your own chart. Your own temperature chart shows the temperatures are going down during the period that you're showing CO2 going through the roof. How could this cause this? If anything, higher CO2 is causing temperatures to go lower. That's his own chart. See his own movie. This guy, possibly, or what he says at one time, the next president of the United States, this man doesn't even know how to read his own chart. Okay? I went through a presentation with Lori David. She was giving this presentation. I asked her about this. She basically got very defensive. She basically told me that my eyes were lying to me and that this, what I just told you, does not occur. Lori David told me that during the CO2, the temperature was not falling. Well, Lori, guess what? My eyes don't lie. Okay? And here it is. This is Lori David. She produced the movie. Here's her own chart. This comes out of Al Gore's movie. Once again, my point was CO2 hit record highs. Temperatures were falling. Okay? Well, Lori, my eyes didn't lie. Peak 1, 2, 3, and 4 are all above peak 5. More importantly, the current data is below peak 5. Temperature falling during the period where CO2 shoots through the roof. Lori, learn how to read your own chart. Al Gore, learn how to read your own chart. I'm going to zoom it in. Clearly, current temperatures are below peak 4 and peak 5. Lori, once again, my eyes don't lie. Sorry. Okay? The key is they're back assward. All right? They have their models backwards. Normally, you have this model, it's y equals mx plus b. Their model is x equals my plus b. Okay? Plus an error. So when you think about independent and dependent variables, they've got their x's and y's back mixed up. This is called a misspecified model. In any normal science, go to any statistical professor, go to anyone in the hard sciences, and present this kind of a model for them, and they're going to look at this and they're going to say, you got a misspecified model. You got the horse in front of the carriage in front of the horse. Your model's backwards. You get an F minus. This is A plus stuff to global warming people. This is an F minus to any other scientist. Take this kind of a model to a statistician, someone who understands the numbers, how to read the charts. They're going to laugh you off the face of the earth if you tell them this. If you're going to tell them that CO2 causes temperature to increase, and then you tell them that CO2 increases 600 years after temperature, your statistic professor is going to give you an F minus. Your algebra teacher will give you an F minus, and yet F minus work is good enough for Al Gore and the environmentalists. Let's take a look at the other data. Remember I told you that the satellite data shows no warming for the last 18 plus years. Okay? All the warming that they show occurs in the last 50, so that leaves this period, 30 years. Okay? But if you look at their own chart, that 30 years shows temperatures decreasing. So their own chart, combined with the NASA data, shows that there is no way for global warming to be going on using their own chart. Once again, the industrial age was going on during this period, and yet we fell in temperatures from the 30s down to the 80s. Matter of fact, that's when we had the good old muscle cars. Okay? Their own charts don't make their case. More importantly, is take a look at this chart. Okay? What you notice here is you have three distinct periods. Increasing, decreasing. Okay? You have CO2 and temperature. The black line, or the black arrow, is the rate of increase of CO2. Clearly the black arrow, which is core samples in Mauna Loa, the behavior of CO2 is totally different during those time periods. The slope, or the rate of change, is flat here, very sharp here. So the second half of the century, CO2, according to Mauna Loa, is shooting through the roof. But once again, remember the flash data showed it was actually decreasing. Okay? So the rate of increase is increasing for CO2. That's huge. Wouldn't you then expect the temperature's rate of increase to increase? But it doesn't. This is the rate of increase. The red line is the rate of increase of temperature. Parallel shifted over here, still a pretty good fit, or your best fit line. Okay? Temperature increases at the same rate here as it did there, and yet CO2 is increasing at a much higher rate. More importantly, temperature decreased from here to here. Okay? None of this stuff makes sense. You would at least expect temperature, the slope of temperature increase to be increasing. It doesn't. Okay, well, join the global warming herd consensus. They keep telling you that there's a global warming consensus. Well, my first comment is, from what you've just seen, if there's a global warming consensus, and the scientists believe this kind of scientific practice, we are in serious trouble, because we've got a possible president of the United States who buys this kind of stuff. If you can sell him this bill of goods, you can sell him anything. Okay? But you take this to any kind of elementary school teacher in science, and they look at this scientific practice of this global warming stuff, they're going to laugh you off the face of the earth. Okay? Okay? Once again, we the sheep, we're going to take a look at this claim of a consensus. Okay? Once again, join the global warming consensus or the dog dies. It seems to be blunt force. You better believe it or not. Al Gore says there's 0 people out there disagreeing with global warming. There's a consensus. How can you disagree with this? Basically, how can you disagree with this junk science? Well, I think I've showed you a bunch of reasons. But the key is, the drumbeat is, nobody disagrees. Well, let's just use some common sense. If that's true, how many Nobel Prizes have been given for global warming? 0. Okay? The consensus today is 180 degrees different from what it was just 30 years ago. How can there be a global warming consensus? And these people are all over the map. They must be very, very easily, their minds must change very easily. Al Gore mocks the scientific consensus in a movie. If you've seen his movie, he mocks the consensus. During the very opening scene, he mocks about how the continents were connected. He mocks that. He later mocks the scientific consensus that at one time smoking was good for you. So even Al Gore mocks the scientific consensus. Back when I was a kid, the consensus was we were going to have overpopulation. We had 10 years of oil supply. We had a coming ice age. At one time there was a consensus that there was a flat Earth, that we would never make it to the moon. Bingo, bingo, bingo. Consensus doesn't prove the truth. The facts prove the truth. Okay? Just because everyone agrees on something doesn't make it the truth. Back in 1492, you would have said, is the world flat? Everyone would agree. Didn't make the world flat, though. And by the way, if they have proven that global warming exists, why don't we just close all the global warming departments then? If it's been proven, why do we need to keep proving it again and again and again? We know that the Earth is not flat. We don't have flat Earth departments at our universities. If it's already so widely accepted, let's throw up our hands and say, okay, it's accepted. Close the departments. We don't need to prove it anymore. Okay? Well, let's take a look at what happens if you disagree with the consent, or you consent from the herd. Also in the science, this is from another scientific report. Once again, you can click on it, go to the source. Also in the scientific discussion, sometimes the sentiment of the generally accepted view of the scientific community is heard, as if verification or falsification of the scientific hypothesis is a matter of majority vote. Once again, it doesn't matter what people think. The data tells you what the truth is, not the opinion of these environmentalists or global warming scientists. They have an agenda. The data doesn't have an agenda. That's why they have to massage the data to make their point. Okay? He also points out that if you disagree with people, you get attacked. Derogatory statements about a person's scientific reputation are the least helpful. Often the less firm arguments are, the more is the interpretation based upon scientific authority through majority. Basically saying, look, if you don't have good science behind you, you go out there and you try to get all your buddies to agree with you. Remember, once again, the flat earth, you would have asked people back in 1492, they would have told you the earth's flat. This, once again, I'd encourage you to download data. Click on this, you can go right to the data. This is what this gentleman concluded when he looked at the data. Same conclusion I've reached. He said basically the data is based on fudged data and ignorance of the physical process of glacial ice formation. I don't know about you, but when I hear a scientist using the term, this is fudged data, that's a smackdown as far as the academic community goes. Down here at the bottom, he says, from the very beginning, the hypothesis of anthropogenic greenhouse warming was tainted with a biased selection of data, and I think I've proven beyond a reasonable doubt there's a tremendously biased selection of data. Ad hoc assumptions using coral and tree rings instead of a direct measurement thermometer were not verified experimentally, and one-sided interpretations. That's clearly what I've seen, and yet this guy will be attacked. I've shown you the data. Does this guy deserve to be attacked? Does there deserve to be a consensus? More importantly, if there's going to be consensus for global warming, I'd expect you to find it in Colorado. This is the land of Ward Churchill. Okay? Good old, remember him? Well, this is a professor at Colorado State University. Now, if this guy is dissenting, he's got to be pretty brave. Well, this is what he says. Global warming is happening, but humans are not the cause. One of the nation's top experts on hurricanes said Monday morning. Bill Gray, who has studied tropical meteorological for more than 40 years, Gray, who is a professor at Colorado State University, said human-induced global warming is a fear perpetuated by the media and scientists who are trying to get federal grants. This guy speaking from the belly of the beast. His co-workers are Ward Churchills, okay? And he's saying this. This is one brave man. Right down here he says, I think we're coming out of the little ice age, and warming is due to changes in the ocean circulation patterns due to salinity variations, as Gray said. I'm sure of that. Okay? So here's one of the experts saying, one, he proves there's not a consensus, and two, he's saying that this is all perpetuated by the media and global warming scientists trying to get funding. And if you see the lifestyle of these people like, I can't remember Lonnie Thompson live. Yeah, they got a lot to protect. These guys live high on the hog. They got the government providing them ships to go travel around and do all their research. They lead a heck of a good life. I encourage anyone to go to a major university and watch one of these guys speak. They love to tell you all their wonderful adventure stories. They're like Indiana Joneses on the taxpayers dying. Okay? Here, once again, all you got to do is go to Google, search something called the Oregon Petition. It states that 17,000 scientists, 6 of whom are Nobel laureates, signed the Oregon Petition, which declares in part there is no convincing scientific evidence that human release of greenhouse gases is causing or will in the foreseeable future cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere and disruption of the Earth's climate. So somehow they have a consensus, but they forgot to ask 17,000 scientists. I think that's pretty weak. Frederick Science, past president of the National Science Academy, states that in part the Kyoto Accord is based upon flawed ideas. Once again, I don't want to read through all this. Go ahead and just download it, read it. There's plenty of people out there that are skeptical of it. Hopefully after you see this presentation, you'll be skeptical too. If you aren't, I encourage you to go back to take Science 101. Okay? Now, if this isn't a crack in the theory, I don't know, is even the French are beginning to jump on the no global warming bandwagon. Okay? This is the most decorated French geophysicist has converted from a believer in man-made catastrophic global warming to a climate skeptic. All right, vive la France! Okay, even the French can figure this out. And he goes on, and to make matters worse, he even picks on Al Gore, saying that this stuff Al Gore says about Kilimanjaro is a bunch of bunk. He goes on and he basically says that it's not due to global warming, it's due to regional weather changes and agricultural changes. Once again, don't take my word for you. This is one of the very few times you'll ever hear me say, listen to the French. Well, listen to them here, because even they're figuring out global warming isn't caused by man. Okay, and he uses Al Gore. He does what I do. He says Al Gore's not telling you the truth either. Well, let's go back and take a look at how realistic it's even to be that man-made CO2 would cause global warming. First, you got to understand what the carbon cycle is. Well, here's the carbon cycle. The important part is look over here at the very far left. Okay, or yeah, far left. Global or fossil fuel burning contributes 5.3 billion tons. Okay, 5.3 billion tons. The oceans produce 20 times plus that, and that's just the circulation. You can think of the oceans as being the Earth's hemoglobin. Okay, trees breathing produce 10 times as much atmospheric CO2 as man does. Once again, trees breathing. I bet most people don't even know trees create CO2. Okay? More importantly is the variation of the oceans. 100 to 115. The variation alone is 3 times that of what man produces. So just the air that the oceans produce is 3 times what man produces. And you're telling me that man is causing some kind of catastrophic increase in CO2 when the ocean's air, the amount they absorb in air, is 3 times that? This is a huge buffer. Okay? Anyone who's taken basic chemistry knows that unless the oceans are saturated with CO2, if man creates any additional CO2, the oceans just simply absorb it. It's called Henry's Law. Henry's Law is the diffusion of a gas in a liquid. That's why if you cool champagne, chill it, freeze it, you can just pop the cork and no big deal. You warm it up and you pop it, it explodes. You put a pop bottle on a burner and the CO2 runs out of it. You cool it, it absorbs CO2. Once again, it's the absorption of gas in a liquid is Henry's Law, and no matter what the global warming people say, they can't repeal Henry's Law. If we produce more CO2 and Mother Nature doesn't like it, she'll absorb it in the oceans. The oceans are like the hemoglobin of the world. Just like when you breathe oxygen into your lungs, hemoglobin absorbs the oxygen, and then it gets traveled to an area where there's low oxygen, and it releases it. That's what the oceans are. Okay? The other thing is, if you look at who produces CO2, Mother Nature produces a whole heck of a lot. Forest fires produce tremendous amounts of CO2. Right now, there's an average of 2.5 million acres burning. There's 47,000 forest fires going on right now for about 2.5 million acres. And that's just in the U.S. Okay? So as you can see, Mother Nature, when she gets angry and she produces CO2, she produces a lot. Far more than man. When Mother Nature, when she gets angry, one volcano can create what was called the year without a summer. So if you go back here, you can say the eruption of Mount Tambora, okay, it created a year where there was no summer. So one single volcano can produce global cooling. Also, by the way, the pollution cools the earth. It doesn't warm it, it cools it. Okay? And as I said, one volcano could cool the earth for summer. Mount St. Helens is the #1 polluter in the state. Right? This is an example of how much pollution one volcano produces more CO2 and pollution than man does in the entire industrial era. But I want you just to get a feel for how much we're talking. This is Mount St. Helens. 9 hours, the volcano released the energy equivalent of 1 atomic bomb every second. I want to repeat that. 9 hours, the volcano released the energy equivalent of 1 atomic bomb per second. Enough rock and crud to fill a football field 600 miles high. I'm willing to bet if you took every power plant, factory, SUV, piled them on top of each other, you wouldn't come anywhere close to 600 miles high. Okay? 3 billion cubic yards of rock, ash, and snow were destroyed. 230 square miles were severely damaged. Okay? Mother Nature pollutes a heck of a lot, and she has no trouble weathering it. She doesn't cause global warming because she has a volcano thing. And also, by the way, they always complain about clear cutting or deforestation. When Mother Nature burns down a forest, that's about as clear cut as you can get. And I'd much rather have them cut down the trees and use them for productive resources, building houses, furniture, newspapers, books, instead of just letting Mother Nature burn them down. Okay, well, the key is you're going to say, okay, so what? You prove that CO2 doesn't cause it. What does cause it then? Well, the sun does. No kidding. Okay, and more importantly, it's well documented. The sun explains 80 to 85% of all global warming. This is one study. The Earth has been warming since 1988. So has temperature been going up. Cause and effect there. There are all sorts of cycles. I don't even want to try to pronounce that, but there's all sorts of cycles out there, of solar cycles, of solar output that have heated and cooled the Earth. And by the way, what do you think they blamed all cooling and warming periods before on? The sun. Okay, so why did this? This is just out this week. The sun is warmer now than any time in the past 11,400 years. So you think it's a coincidence that temperatures are, from what they claim, record highs, and the sun is also at a record high? I mean, it's like, hello, cause and effect? I mean, don't you think they'll sit there and say, well, you know, we got all these opportunities. We got the sun here, we got CO2 here, we got the water vapor here. Hey, ignore the sun, ignore water vapor. Oh, I think it's CO2. Give me a break. Just walk out on your patio in the morning. Watch the sun come up. Believe me, it gets warm, and then when it goes down, it'll get cool. If there's any reason to download this presentation, it's to download for this data. Go and click on this. This is a fantastic review of the data. It's where I get a lot of my ideas from, and it shows you how the data manipulation occurs. Once again, we go through global warming on an annual basis. Okay? Global warming is caused by the tilting of the Earth and the orbit around the sun. Okay? So it doesn't make logical sense that if there's a little tilt in the orbit over the long run or recently, that the southern hemisphere would cool and the northern hemisphere would warm. That's what I would think. It's just a normal process. Okay? Al Gore, in his own book, points out that it's the sun's causing the melting of the polar cap. Nowhere in this part does he even mention atmospheric CO2. And also, if you do his numbers, because light that hits the oceans is absorbed, and so there's not a lot to be reflected to be causing global warming to begin with, or the greenhouse effect. So there's no real real light being reflected around up here at the oceans. It's either bounced off the ice cap or it's absorbed. But even Al Gore says it's the sun that's causing the global warming or the melting of the ice caps, not CO2. Okay? Once again, and remember how I said that terrarium before? If they really could prove this, they'd simply have a terrarium and they'd change the CO2 levels with the same amount of light being applied, and you see temperature increase. Well, of course they've done that. You don't find reports about it anywhere because it doesn't show what they're trying to prove. However, they did experimentally test the theory of the change of the sun. An experiment by Danish scientists offers convincing evidence linking global warming to an increase in cosmic radiation. They've proven that the small changes in the sun can lead to global warming. They haven't proven experimentally that changes of CO2 can lead to global warming. So why, once again, if you have experimental data, if you have a test, if you have an experiment that you can test and reproduce and test again and prove one thing, why do you rely on one that you can't prove? It makes no sense experimentally. If I have a drug that I give to a patient and I can prove that blood pressure goes down and I have a witch doctor next to him saying that he can also decrease it, why, if I can't prove that that witch doctor is causing the blood pressure to go down, would I ever believe that theory when I have a drug that I can prove the cause and effect on? It doesn't make any sense, and yet that's good science for global warming. Okay, down here it says it's Svenmark's team managed to reproduce the gases and chemistry of the lower atmosphere inside a chamber of 7 cubic meters. Into this simulated atmosphere, they fired a beam of charged particles like the high-energy cosmic radiation manages to penetrate the Earth's magnetic field. These measurements of the charged particles they created and the rates of the nucleation matched with those required to have a measurable impact on climate. They prove experimentally evidence to support the theory. Experimental evidence. You don't see that with global warming. In natural sciences, and this is what he points out, in natural science, if you can't measure it, you can't prove it. Show me anywhere that someone's taken and proven that by increasing CO2, you increase temperature. You don't. It's all guesswork based on fudged data. And yet you can prove the sun does it, and Al Gore never mentions the sun in his thing. He does it in his book without really knowing what he's doing. Okay? He never mentions water vapor, never mentions the sun as the main cause. Okay? Once again, here's the correlation. Remember how I said about correlation and causation? These, and see how they overlap the two so you can see the relationship? They don't do that with the CO2 and the temperature graphs, but they do when they show you the sun and the temperature. That's a pretty tight fit, and the sun leads the temperature. So once again, if you look there, typically you also hear them talk in terms of what R squared. R squared is a statistical measure for the explanatory power of a model. I would say that has a pretty high R squared. Once again, it's well known, scientists blame the sun for global warming. The truth about global warming, it's the sun to blame. Okay? Over here, Garfield, duh. I mean, what are you thinking? Why would you ever think CO2? Once again, do me a favor, download this presentation, click on this, show it to your science teacher, start getting the truth out, or at least start challenging these ideas, and that's all I'm asking you to do. Don't just be a sheeple and listen to Al Gore. Don't listen to me. Do your own research. Does this stuff make sense scientifically? I argue no. Okay, now if I'm going to claim that it's the sun that's causing it, okay? Well, if the sun's causing it, it's not only going to be impacting the Earth, it's going to be impacting other things in the solar system. Isn't that a logical conclusion? If I claim the sun's causing it, not only would I be able to have to prove that the Earth is warming, but I have to prove other planets in the solar system are warming also. Well, guess what? Sure enough, Mars is warming. Okay, and there are no SUVs up on Mars. So clearly that's even more evidence that the sun is causing the global warming, not the industrial age. Or else you have to somehow figure out why Mars would be warming and not the world, not the Earth. Okay? But I think that's the most damning data right there. Mars is warming also. SUVs in the industrial age cannot be causing Mars to warm. This is another thing that's kind of odd. Once again, they keep trumping up CO2, but look down here, methane. Methane is a naturally produced greenhouse gas. All greenhouse gases are increasing. Okay? So, even if I give you man causes CO2 to increase, why are the other greenhouse gases increasing? More than likely, it's just a natural phenomenon. As I've said, as the sun heats the Earth, more CO2 is produced. There's more forest fires, there's more respiration, there's more growth. There's just simply, and the oceans boil out CO2. Mother Nature causes greenhouse gases to go up with an increase in temperature. There's no way the environmentalists can get away from that. And by the way, they'll always be able to prove themselves right because they have a misspecified model. You know for the fact that if it gets warmer, you know CO2 is going to go higher, but one's not causing the other, or CO2 is not causing temperature, temperature causes CO2. But they're always going to be right. Okay? Now you're saying, wait a minute, are you telling me that scientists are lying? You've got to be kidding me. There's no way. We've got to trust these people. If you search global warming myth on YouTube, you'll hear an NPR interview with a scientist. I think it's like global warming myth 18, 19, and 20. I encourage you to listen to it. And you let me know if you think these environmentalists don't twist the facts. Well, believe it or not, one of the greatest scientists ever, Albert Einstein, twisted the facts. When he was working on the theory of relativity, you got to remember, at his point, the Hubble telescope hadn't been invented. They didn't know that the universe was expanding. They thought there was a static universe at that time. So when Albert Einstein would run all his models, he had an assumption built into his model that the universe was static. It wasn't expanding. Right? So he would run a model, he would run an experiment, and it would keep giving him an answer he didn't expect. Right? Now, a normal scientist would sit there and say, well, you follow the data to reach the truth. But Albert Einstein was so convinced that he was right and the facts were wrong, but remember, he didn't know the universe expanded. He came up with something called the cosmological constant. He created a fudge factor for his own model. Right? That's bad science, and he admits it. Down here it says, much later when I was discussing the cosmological problem with Albert Einstein, he remarked that the introduction of the cosmological term was the biggest blunder of his life. He knew he was fudging the data. But the mistake he made as a scientist was he felt he knew more than the model and the data. He decided what the answer should be, not the data. And that was his mistake, and that's what he called the biggest blunder he ever made. Similar examples are DDT, LR, silicone. They basically just want to believe something. They go out and they put a lot of people out of work. They kill a lot of people with for instance, with the DDT. Okay? Because they aren't letting the data shape the conclusion. They reach a conclusion and they go cherry pick data to support their position. That's bad science. Okay? Similar story occurred with the British solar eclipse experiment of 1919. They went up, reached a conclusion, they came back, gave their data to other scientists. When the other scientists rechecked the data, it didn't come anywhere near the conclusion they reached. Okay? Here they say global warming is based on biased models. Okay, the scientists know that they have bad models. Other scientists are coming out and saying, wait a minute, these are biased models? No kidding. Well, you won't hear Al Gore tell you that. But why? You're asking, why in the world would they go through all this? Now, this is the area where you can disagree with me. All the other stuff is supported by science. This is where I'm going to give them a little opinion, editorialization. Why would they do this? Well, I look back in history, why have they always done it? One, there's a lot of money. First, there's money in it. Global warming creates a lot of money. You got a lot of organizations built on fighting global warming. You got all these Greenpeace, Sierra Club, World Wildlife Fund, the UN, Michael Crichton in State of Fear, which is a book I recommend you read, points out that you never heard about global warming until the fall of the Soviet Union, and the governments had to justify their existence, so they had to come up with another boogeyman. So he claims that global warming replaced the Soviet threat. Okay, $25 billion has been spent on global warming research since 1990. Lonnie Thompson lives a phenomenal life. You can click on this and you go to a YouTube video of Al Gore explaining, you can give money. Also, California is suing the auto manufacturers for producing. There's a lot of ways to make money. They're just recently part of Colorado passed a carbon tax. Branson just donated $3 billion to global warming. There's a lot of money. You can convince a lot of people to give you a lot of money with this stuff. People just love to buy into this stuff. They like the hype of it, and they think they're going to solve the world with it. Okay? Okay. Al Gore says he's pushing a pollution tax. It's a way to expand government. It's a way to have government have more control over your life. They push a pollution tax. So really, the alternative motive really isn't fighting global warming. Just like when they passed they punished the tobacco companies, you would have thought they made tobacco illegal, but they didn't. They kept it alive, but they taxed it. They basically just had an excuse for the government to seize some of the tobacco companies' assets. If they really were trying to stamp out smoking or cancer, they would have made tobacco illegal. They didn't. They kept it alive, and they taxed it. So they keep making money off of it. So it's basically just a way for the government to seize some assets. My good old dog down here is chasing his tail again. We're going to tax people based on junk science? Come on. Okay, power. Al Gore is going to be his main vector to taking back the White House. This man feels that he can motivate enough people, scare enough people into voting for him because of global warming. He's going to save the planet. This guy is Superman. I should put a big old S on his shirt. Next time I will for the presentation. But I can tell you one thing. If you can take the White House based on global warming, we're in serious trouble. If you haven't seen his movie is a fantastic piece of propaganda. He weaves a great story of fearing global warming, and the hidden agenda is vote for Al. He replaces terrorism as our greatest threat, believe it or not. Okay? Movie is pretty boring, but another reason to download this presentation, click on this thing or go to YouTube and search Al Gore's Penguin Army. It's a pretty doggone good video. Okay? Fame. Look at this guy. He loves it. Okay? You're talking about wanting to expand an ego? Get out there and make a documentary on global warming. This guy, not only did he invent the internet, for God's sake, this guy's ego got even bigger when he comes up with, he's going to save the earth with global warming. Okay? Basically, help expand Al Gore's ego, believe in global warming. Control. 1984 type stuff. This is a Lyndon Johnson video called the Daisy commercial. What I found real interesting about this is this was back in the 60s, early 60s. This was to put the fear of God in you about nuclear war. This is almost an identical type video, and I encourage you to go download this presentation, click on this, and go watch this. This has to do with global warming. They took the exact same thing, but they replaced the nuclear threat with global warming. I found this very fascinating. Okay? The fear tactics. They want to scare you to death. I mean, just Al Gore up here in the far left scares me to death. Okay? Okay, he's all big on this. If you just read his own chart, what does it say? By far the most terrifying film you will ever see. This is a scare tactic. This is propaganda type stuff. The global warning. Okay? He wants to scare people to death. Okay? Once again, by far the most terrifying, I'd say by far one of the most boring and misleading films ever produced. But Al Gore wants you to be scared by it. And believe me, there's a lot of people out there that are scared to death of this stuff. They'll go vote for this guy. This guy. Okay? This is going to be the next president. Right? Scared. You want to be scared. Others, there's honest disagreement. But the key is, if you really look at it, at best what they've done is they've gone and cherry-picked data to make their argument. Not only have they had to cherry-pick data, they've had to massage their data. If this was good science, you wouldn't have to cherry-pick data. You wouldn't have to massage the data. The data would just be put together and it would spit out, there's no question here. You wouldn't need to come up with a hockey stick chart to replace a chart that you already had to make your argument. That's just bad science. They're also what I call environmentalist fundamentalists. They just believe in this stuff. You know, flat out, they believe it. These are, it's a religion to these people. There's select data does support it. I mean, there's some evidence out there that does support global warming. The problem is the data that's the most convincing, as I showed you, is very weak. It's massaged data. Also, if you're China, you're begging for the American people to buy into this global warming. This is the greatest way in the world for China to catch up with us. If we impose these taxes and slow down our economy, that just makes it easier for China to overcome us. China is no way are they going to be abide by the Kyoto Treaty. They're not that dumb. Lack of critical analysis skills. Al Gore clearly doesn't understand how to read a chart. Okay? If people don't understand what they're talking about, and that's why I did this video, so people can understand what they're talking about, so they can talk intelligently about this. If people don't understand the science behind it, it's easy to convince them anything they want. Okay? And the other thing is people just want to believe. They want to believe they can save the earth. They want to believe man is hurting the earth. They want to believe all this kind of stuff. That's the whole philosophy that keeps the environmental movement moving along. Okay? What's the harm? The other thing is you heard, what is the harm? Well, the harm is huge. Okay? Cost of Kyoto may be high regardless of flexible mechanisms. Okay? Bill Clinton came out and said it was going to cost $12 billion a year. Other estimates are $300 billion a year. No one exactly knows. Okay? Now, if you can go out there and you can get all these estimates ranging from $12 billion to $3 billion, I've seen even higher ones. Okay? Now, are you telling me that we should be supporting this thing if we don't know what the costs are going into it? And by the way, this is a government estimate. Show me ever when the government comes close to an estimate. You can bet on it. The government gets involved. It's going to be 10 times that. Okay? Some of these estimates, once again, are as high as $300 billion a year. Why? For junk science. California, they're suing 6 car makers over greenhouse gases. This is nothing more than a way for them to raise money. But you start suing our auto manufacturers, you can put them out of business. GM and Ford are almost bankrupt. This is the type of stuff that can push them over the edge, just like we pushed Dow Corning over the edge. Okay? Down here at the bottom things, why should developed countries do anything? Why might developed countries care enough about climate change, do anything about it? The answer depends on how much people in developed countries care about people in developed countries and how expensive it is to do something worthwhile. Abatement programs in the number of economic models suggest that doing something worthwhile would cost about 2% of GDP in perpetuity. 2% of the U.S. GDP is over $100 billion a year, and that is an annual cost that would continue on forever. Do you want to spend that kind of money on global warming? Well, I'd say we've got a heck of a lot better uses for it. We've got to show up Social Security. Sooner we're going to have 2 workers for every 1 retiree. We got some serious problems with Social Security. We got Medicare. We can spending money on education. Here's the federal budget. We could shore up some of the deficit. Once again, this is a huge waste of money. It's dangerous. It basically could bankrupt America because we already have these entitlement programs that are going to cause it. Okay? The other thing that fears that there is a politicization of science. Nazism is a direct result of the politicization of eugenics. If you read the book State of Fear by Michael Crichton, he covers that. Go back and do a search in Google called eugenics, Margaret Sanger, Nazism, and you'll see a pretty disgusting history of the politicization of science. Remember, eugenics was the quote-unquote progressive ideas of the progressive groups back in the early 1900s. But once again, anytime you see a politician getting involved with science, start thinking Orwellian 1984 type stuff. This is not what you want to see. You want to see things, the government making decisions based upon sound science, not on political agendas. Okay? Once again, you can go back to dangers of politicization of science. Once again, we banned DDT. That cost 1 million lives a year. Imagine if you're a family over in sub-Saharan Africa and your child is dying of malaria, and nothing was done about it because Rachel Carlson wrote a book based on junk science over here in the U.S. Could you imagine that? People died because of banning of DDT, and now the WHO reverses itself. Who's going to go back and bring all those people back to life? Who's going to go and fix all those destroyed lives? Okay, that's the cost of this junk science. Once again, there's a whole bunch of other things here. I encourage you to download, click on it, and go do the research. Okay. The World According to Al Gore. Your presentation is okay. This is I went to a presentation with Dr. Fred Singer, President of Science and Environment Policy Project. www.sepp.org. I encourage you to check it out. Well, he invited Al Gore to give his presentation to his group. And this is the quote that he gave Al Gore when it was asked about what did you think about it. He said to Al Gore's face, "Your presentation is very persuasive to anyone that doesn't know the science." Okay? He basically insulted Al Gore to his face, saying that, "Look, pal, you don't know the science. This is all junk science." But this guy, believe me, knows a lot more than Al Gore, and he felt strongly enough about it to basically insult Al Gore to his face. I met this gentleman. He's a great gentleman. I would go check out his website. He's one of the critics that people attack. Matter of fact, I went to another presentation at OSU, that being the Ohio State University, where they had, in the sociology department of all places, a person that was a renowned scientist from the University of Oklahoma came in here, and his science was based upon the global warming skeptics, and he basically had what I would call a blacklist, is the only term that you can use, a blacklist of global warming skeptics. So there's a concerted effort in the scientific community to stamp out people like Dr. Fred Singer. But I tell you one thing, from watching this presentation, I would argue that they have a far better argument than the global warming scientists do. And no matter how much demonization they can do, the truth will eventually be heard. Here, once again, Al Gore says that global warming is our greatest threat. I don't even think that's barely even worth addressing. If he thinks that global warming is a bigger threat than what we're facing today in this world with the radical terrorists, I just simply disagree. Kim Jong-il may have a nuclear bomb. We may be turning over Iraq to the terrorists. If we do that, the terrorists in Iraq will then control the world's second largest oil reserve. They will have the resources to do anything they want. They can go over and buy bombs from Kim Jong-il. They don't need to develop them like Iran is. Okay? So if you seriously think you want to have a president that's going to fight global warming instead of terrorism, go right at it. But I'm telling you one thing, I'm willing to bet you it's going to cost you thousands, if not millions of lives. Okay? And once again, if we turn over Iraq to the terrorists, they've got the world's second largest oil reserves. They won't develop a bomb, they'll buy it. Okay? Population boom, once again, this is Al Gore's own chart showing that population is shot through the roof. Well, my point is, that's true. Population has shot through the roof, but what are you going to do about it? What's the alternative? Is the alternative to pass a carbon tax, decrease the standard of living, okay? Basically start to starve people? I would say no. The key is, how do you handle a situation like this? Do you adjust for it? If we do experience global warming, isn't it smarter to adjust for it than to sit there and try to stop it when we really can't and waste all that money? We got a problem with population. You know, if you buy Al's argument, we've got a problem. What are we going to do about it? I would argue we've got to feed these people. And you want to know what? Crop yield increases with CO2. So we need higher atmospheric CO2 to produce more food to feed these people. If you cut CO2 out of the atmosphere, your crop yield decreases. That means you have to increase your acreage. So it's environmentally unfriendly to decrease atmospheric CO2 because you have to plow, plant, fertilize more acreage because the yield goes down. We need atmospheric CO2. We don't need to decrease it. Otherwise, the crop yield goes down. Okay? Once again, starving people destroy the environment. This is from Al Gore's book. So once again, we need to have strong, solid economies that feed their people and can manage the environment. Starving people don't do that. Okay? Fighting global warming and wasting our money, creating more starving people, create environmental disasters. Rich nations keep their environments healthy. Poor nations typically don't. Okay? Once again, Brazil. Venezuela embraces big cars, cheap gas. So as you can see, that even the socialists, or Chavez, they don't seem to ignore. They seem to ignore this global warming stuff. But more importantly, is ethanol is a big thing. They want to push ethanol over petroleum. Down in Brazil is the world's largest producer of ethanol. The way that they're producing ethanol in Brazil is cutting down the rainforest to grow sugarcane to produce ethanol. So their solutions to fight all this stuff is environmentally a disaster. Okay? Ethanol, and I encourage you to go watch the DVD or the video we have out there on ethanol, the Internet Skeptics Guide to Ethanol, or I call it Deathanol. Watch that DVD where we cover the science. But once again, the environmental solution is worse than the cure. The cure is worse than disease. Okay. Once again, we're cutting down the rainforest to produce ethanol in Brazil. Al Gore, once again, for some reason, he thinks agriculture is the enemy. This is his ideal. You don't feed very many people that. Okay. Al Gore's agenda is to starve people to death so there aren't that many people. This is the hero in my book. In his book, it's the villain. If you ever watched that book, Grapes of Wrath, the tractor was the villain in the book, The Grapes of Wrath. Okay? But we need these people feeding the people. Al Gore would rather have you starve the people. I would say, go ahead and feed it. Once again, he's arguing against irrigation. Okay, in agriculture. Once again, we need agriculture to feed these people. The alternative is starving people. Okay? Al Gore in his movie shows that the polar bears are actually decreasing. I encourage anyone to go prove that. Everything I showed showed that polar bear populations are actually increasing. So he basically comes out and lies. They do this all the time using some little pet animal, you know, like the spotted owl and all sorts of things. They'll exaggerate the claims and use some animal as their mascot for saving the earth. But bottom line is the polar bears aren't decreasing. Figures don't lie. This is a great way of Al Gore showing that the climate change has caused all this destruction. He uses, out of all things, insurance claims. Okay. First of all, he uses nominal dollars. So what you see here is inflation. Plus, over that time, you don't know if more people are basically just insuring their properties or their properties may be worth more. There's probably a lot more coastal homes being insured than back then. So basically, he uses some chart to make his claim, insurance claims, that the cost of insurance has gone up due to the tremendously large number of hurricanes, when this chart doesn't show anywhere near that. At best, it shows inflation. If you put the Dow Jones Industrial over there, it would show the same thing. Okay? So basically, he just lies with numbers. Difference between real and nominal numbers. Okay? Fire prevent, and then they, if you really want to call it, what's causing global warming is the forest fires. The environmentalists have caused catastrophic forest fires in our forests because they push for this no logging. They push for no thinning the forest. They want to preserve all the forest. By doing that, they've created an overly dense forest. They've basically created our forests to be tinderboxes. The Park Service says that our forests are 7 to 11 times more dense than a healthy forest, so that when we have a forest fire today, we don't have just a little forest fire, we have catastrophic forest fires, and that's directly related to the environmentalists preventing the thinning of our forests. So once again, this is another environmental force that's just resorting to catastrophes. This one I put in here just as a joke. In Al Gore's movie, he shows that with global warming, you flood parts of the land. Well, this is San Francisco. We got all the environmentalists out there. Global warming would turn San Francisco into a wetland. How can they argue against that? Let's turn San Francisco into a wetland. I think that's a great idea. So there are benefits to global warming. Okay. Once again, food doesn't grow in the snow. Global cooling is by far the bigger threat. Ice in the greenhouse. Earth may be cooling, not warming. This is a recent report. Once again, they're going back to, well, you know what? Guess what? We may not be warming. We may actually be going into that ice age that we were talking about back in the 70s. So even the research today is saying, well, there might be coming ice age. More importantly is, how can you have a consensus if you've got these guys saying that they're going to ice age? This also is a good link, Global Warming. Enjoy it while you can. It goes and reviews all the benefits of global warming. Okay. Okay, so their model is a very simplistic model. CO2 causes global warming. This is the Internet Skeptics model. He says it's possibly due to solar cycles, variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun, variations in the solar system's orbit in the galaxy, natural greenhouse gas variations, volcanospores fires, and natural pollutions, continental drift altering the size of the ocean basins and landmass, cyclical weather and ocean patterns, occasional asteroid impact, ocean current salinity and changes in the Earth's magnetic field, changes in the Earth's axis. That's a more complex model. That's probably more a realistic model of what's causing global warming. It's certainly not a simple model like CO2 causes global warming. These are all factors that impact it. I'd be willing to bet CO2 is one of the least important of all of them. In conclusion, CO2 isn't at record levels according to flash data. Temperatures aren't at record levels according to Al's own chart. Temperature drives CO2, not vice versa. CO2 is at best an insignificant factor in global warming. Global warming theory isn't supported by the scientific method or their own data and models. Once again, I would say what they've done is they've cherry-picked data to support their conclusion. They reached a conclusion and then they went to find data to support it instead of digging up data to reach a conclusion. They've got the scientific method backwards. Global warming theory is the result of a misspecified and underspecified model, meaning that A, they have their Y's and their X's reversed, and 2, they don't have all the variables that they need. They don't even know what the global warming potential of water vapor is, okay? Which requires data manipulation and violations of commonly accepted scientific practices to reach its preconceived conclusion. Once again, they reach a conclusion, we've got to somehow prove man causes this, go out, find the data, massage the data to reach their conclusion. Bad science all the way around. Once again, you can get this presentation at www.theinternetskeptic.com. Download it, change it, challenge it. People out on YouTube, if you like it or you challenge it, post your comments. But once again, know what you're talking about before you post the comments, because everyone else is going to know what they're talking about. And if you post a comment that's pretty stupid, everyone else is going to realize how stupid it is, because they've got the data to rely on. Okay. Well, once again, www.internetskeptic.com. Do a search for YouTube. Global warming myth. Thank you very much. Zip.
Way too long. Way too long. I've been down here an hour. Way too long. Way too long. I've been down here an hour.